Jessica knew the table was wrong the moment the hostess pointed her toward it. It sat in the far corner of the ballroom, almost touching the swinging kitchen doors where waiters rushed in and out with trays of champagne and steaming plates. The music from the dance floor sounded distant there, muffled by the clatter of dishes and the occasional hiss of the kitchen behind her. It was the table no one wanted. The leftover table. The one where relatives ended up when the seating chart ran out of better options. Jessica lowered herself into the chair slowly, smoothing the simple navy dress she'd worn to 3 different family events already. From here she could see everything without anyone really seeing her. The dance floor glittered under golden lights. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead like frozen stars. Her younger sister Sophia stood near the center of it all in a white gown that probably cost more than Jessica's rent for 3 months. Guests circled around her, smiling and congratulating the happy couple. Laughter echoed across the ballroom. Champagne glasses clinked. Jessica kept her hands folded tightly in her lap and tried to breathe slowly. This was supposed to be a happy night. Instead it felt like sitting in the front row of a life she didn't belong to anymore. Across the ballroom, Tyler leaned close to Vanessa, whispering something that made her throw her head back and laugh. Vanessa rested one hand proudly on her rounded stomach. 7 months pregnant. The dress she wore shimmered under the lights like liquid gold. Tyler noticed Jessica looking. For a moment their eyes met across the room. He didn't smile. He just looked at her the way people looked at old photographs they'd forgotten to throw away. Jessica quickly turned back toward the table, staring at the half-empty glass of water in front of her. She told herself not to think about it. Not tonight. Not here. Lily should have been the one sitting beside her, swinging her small feet under the chair and asking 100 questions about the decorations. Jessica had promised to show her pictures later. Her daughter had tried so hard not to look disappointed when Jessica explained that the wedding was too formal for kids. The truth was simpler and harder. Jessica couldn't afford the extra plate the wedding required for children. And she couldn't afford a professional sitter either. Camila had offered to watch Lily for free, but Jessica still felt the weight of it sitting there alone while the rest of the family celebrated together. The kitchen doors burst open behind her and a waiter brushed past carrying a tray of glasses. One of them tipped slightly and spilled a drop of champagne onto the tablecloth near Jessica's hand. He apologized quickly before hurrying away again. No one else noticed. No one ever noticed the table near the kitchen doors. The music shifted to a slower song. Couples began drifting toward the dance floor. Jessica saw her parents move together easily, smiling for photos with distant relatives. She saw cousins pairing off with their dates. Even the older guests seemed to find partners. It made the empty chair across from her feel louder somehow. A shadow fell across the table. Jessica looked up. Tyler stood there with his hands in his pockets, wearing the same confident smile that had once convinced her he loved her. Up close the smile looked thinner, colder. "You clean up well," he said quietly. His voice carried just enough amusement to sting. Jessica kept her posture straight. "What do you want, Tyler?" He glanced around the ballroom like he was bored already. "Just checking on you. You looked a little out of place." Jessica said nothing. Tyler leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You know everyone's talking about you tonight, right?" Jessica felt her stomach tighten. "About how you showed up alone." Again. He shrugged casually. "I guess some people never learn from their mistakes." Jessica stood up so fast the chair legs scraped loudly against the floor. A few nearby guests glanced over before returning to their conversations. Tyler's eyes flicked toward the movement and then back to her face. "Careful," he murmured. "You're drawing attention." Jessica grabbed her purse from the table. She wasn't staying another minute. She didn't care if it meant walking home in heels through the rain that had started outside the windows. Anything was better than sitting there while Tyler and Vanessa played happy family across the room. She turned toward the exit that led to the hallway, and nearly walked straight into someone. The man stepped forward at the exact moment she did, blocking her path with quiet precision. He was taller than anyone else in the room by at least a head. Dark hair. Broad shoulders inside a perfectly tailored black suit. The kind of suit that made the rest of the ballroom look cheap by comparison. Jessica blinked in surprise. "Sorry," she said automatically, trying to step around him. He moved again. Not aggressively. Just enough to stay directly in front of her. His eyes were dark and steady, studying her face like he already knew something about her that she didn't. The music swelled behind them as another couple spun across the dance floor. The stranger leaned slightly closer, close enough that she could hear his voice over the music, but no one else could. "Pretend you're my wife," he whispered calmly. Jessica stared at him. "What?" His gaze flicked briefly across the ballroom, scanning the crowd with sharp attention before returning to her. "Just for one dance," he said softly. "Trust me." Jessica felt a sudden strange silence ripple through the room. Took her a second to realize why. Conversations nearby had slowed. People were looking in their direction. Her cousin Vanessa had turned toward them. Tyler too. Several relatives were whispering behind raised glasses of champagne. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as the realization settled over her. The entire ballroom was suddenly watching them. Jessica should have said no. Every rational instinct in her body screamed that agreeing to a stranger's strange request in the middle of a wedding reception was a terrible idea. But the silence around them had grown heavier, the kind that happens when too many eyes focus on the same moment. Her cousin Vanessa had already turned fully in their direction. Tyler's expression shifted from curiosity to something sharper, something irritated. And the stranger standing in front of Jessica looked completely calm, as if he had already decided what was going to happen next. Jessica felt heat rising in her face. If she refused now, if she pushed past him and walked toward the exit, every person in the ballroom would watch her do it. They would whisper later about how strange it looked, how desperate she seemed, how awkward the moment had been. The stranger extended his hand slowly, giving her the smallest reassuring nod. "Just one dance," he repeated quietly. Jessica hesitated for a fraction of a second longer. Then she placed her hand in his. The reaction was immediate. Conversations resumed, but quieter now, like a room adjusting to new information. Music drifted through the ballroom as another slow song began. The stranger guided her toward the center of the dance floor with the easy confidence of someone who had never been refused anything in his life. When they reached the crowd of swaying couples, he turned toward her smoothly. His hand settled at the small of her back. The touch was firm but controlled, his fingers resting just above her waist as if he had practiced the movement 1,000 times. Jessica's breath caught slightly. Up close he smelled faintly of cedar and something darker she couldn't place. "Expensive." "Smile," he murmured under the music. Jessica blinked at him. "What?" His eyes stayed locked on hers. "Smile," he repeated softly. "And look at me like you trust me." The instruction was so unexpected that Jessica almost laughed. But the stranger's expression remained serious. She forced a small polite smile, the kind she used with difficult parents at the hospital when a child's treatment wasn't going well. The stranger studied her face for a moment. "Better," he said quietly. "Now relax your shoulders." The music carried them slowly across the floor. Jessica followed his lead automatically, surprised by how easily he moved. His steps were precise, confident. Each turn felt controlled, deliberate. He wasn't just dancing. He was guiding her through the space like someone navigating a map only he could see. Jessica became aware of the weight of eyes again. Her parents stood near the edge of the dance floor whispering to each other. Her mother's eyebrows had lifted halfway to her hairline. Vanessa leaned close to Tyler, clearly asking questions. Tyler himself wasn't whispering. He was staring directly at them, his jaw tight. "You're attracting attention," Jessica said under her breath. The stranger didn't look toward Tyler. Instead his gaze drifted slowly around the room, passing over clusters of guests, waiters, the bar area. His eyes lingered briefly on the entrance doors. then on the balcony above the ballroom, then on a man standing near the champagne table. It didn't look like casual observation. It looked like evaluation. Jessica felt a small knot tighten in her stomach. "You're not really here for the wedding, are you?" she asked quietly. The stranger's mouth curved faintly. No, the honesty surprised her. "Then why are you here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead he turned her gently as the music shifted, positioning them so her back faced the main doors. Jessica noticed the movement but didn't understand it. Not until she saw his eyes narrow slightly. "Because someone invited me," he said calmly. "And someone else would prefer I didn't leave tonight." Jessica frowned. "That doesn't make any sense." "It will." His voice lowered further. "Eventually." She watched him closely now. The longer the dance continued, the more certain she became that something was wrong. He wasn't distracted by her the way most men were when they danced with someone new. His attention kept drifting outward, over shoulders, past heads, toward shadows at the edges of the room, counting exits, measuring distances. Jessica realized suddenly that he was using the dance as cover. The realization made her pulse quicken. "You're watching everyone," she said quietly. "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead he adjusted his grip slightly at her waist and turned them again, changing direction across the floor. His eyes swept past the bar area where two unfamiliar men had just stepped inside the ballroom. They didn't look like wedding guests. Dark suits, hard expressions, standing too still. The stranger's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Jessica felt it before she saw it. Something had changed. The calm ease he'd carried moments ago sharpened into something colder, something alert. She followed his gaze instinctively toward the entrance. The two men had separated slightly, drifting into the crowd. They weren't dancing. They weren't greeting anyone. They were scanning the room. Jessica's fingers tightened slightly on his shoulder. "Do you know them?" she whispered. For the first time since the dance began, the stranger leaned closer to her ear. His voice dropped low enough that only she could hear him over the music. "Yes," he murmured. Jessica waited for more explanation. Instead he turned them slowly again, moving them farther toward the center of the floor where the crowd was thickest. The movement shielded them from direct view of the entrance. "Who are they?" she asked. The stranger's eyes flicked briefly back toward the doors before settling on her again. The calm expression returned to his face, but it looked different now. Controlled. Intentional. As if the smile he wore had become part of the disguise. "My name is Giovanni Fioraldi," he said quietly. Jessica blinked. She hadn't realized until that moment that he had never introduced himself. "Giovanni," she repeated. The name felt unfamiliar and heavy in her mouth. Giovanni's gaze moved past her shoulder again. When he spoke next, his voice was almost thoughtful. "And unfortunately," he murmured, "someone here is planning to hurt me tonight." Jessica blinked, certain she had misheard him. The music drifted softly around them, couples swaying beneath the warm glow of chandeliers, waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne. Nothing about the room suggested danger. Nothing about the moment suggested violence. It looked like any other wedding reception. She searched Giovanni's face for some hint of humor. "That's not funny," she said quietly. Giovanni didn't smile. His eyes moved again, slow and deliberate, passing over the guests nearest the bar. "I'm not joking." Jessica felt the words settle uneasily in her chest. She studied him more carefully now. The calm expression he wore hadn't changed, but the focus in his gaze had sharpened. It reminded her of doctors in the emergency ward when a patient suddenly stopped breathing. Stillness before action. "Then explain," she said under her breath. "Why would someone want to hurt you at a wedding?" Giovanni didn't answer directly. Instead he shifted their position again, guiding her through a smooth turn that brought the bar area briefly into her view. "Who is the man standing near the champagne tower?" he asked. Jessica followed his gaze. A middle-aged man in a dark suit stood alone beside the long table of glasses. He looked slightly uncomfortable, checking his watch repeatedly. "That's Mr. Martinelli," she said. "Friend of the groom's family. He owns several restaurants." Giovanni nodded slightly, as if confirming something. His hand tightened fractionally at her waist. "And the man beside the pillar?" Jessica looked again. Another guest leaned casually against a column, scrolling through his phone. "I don't know him," she admitted. "Maybe one of Sophia's husband's co-workers." Giovanni absorbed the answer without reacting. Then he asked another question. "Who arranged the seating tonight?" Jessica frowned. "What does that have to do with anything? Humor me." "My aunt organized most of it," Jessica said slowly. "Sophia handled the guest list." Giovanni's gaze drifted toward the corner of the room where Jessica had been sitting earlier near the kitchen doors. "And you were placed at the table near the service entrance." The way he said it made Jessica pause. "How did you know that?" Giovanni didn't respond immediately. Instead he guided her through another step as the music shifted slightly in tempo. His movements remained smooth, but Jessica could feel a subtle urgency behind them now. "Who is Tyler?" he asked quietly. Jessica stiffened. "You heard that name." Giovanni didn't look at Tyler, but Jessica could tell he already knew exactly where the man stood in the room. "Your ex-husband," he said calmly. Jessica's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" Giovanni finally looked down at her again. His expression remained composed, but something colder had crept into his eyes. "Because men like him are predictable," he said softly. "The way he approached you earlier, the way he's watching us now, that kind of anger rarely hides well." Jessica resisted the instinct to turn and check. "You're making assumptions." Giovanni tilted his head slightly. "Am I?" Jessica hesitated. "He's my daughter's father." Giovanni absorbed the information quietly. "And the woman beside him?" "My cousin." Jessica's voice tightened slightly. "They're expecting a baby." Giovanni's gaze flicked briefly across the room again. This time Jessica followed it. Tyler still stood near the edge of the dance floor, his posture tense. Vanessa whispered something to him while glancing repeatedly in Jessica's direction. Jessica turned back toward Giovanni. "You're asking a lot of questions about people you supposedly don't know," she said carefully. Giovanni's lips curved faintly. "Observation is a useful habit." "Observation?" Jessica shook her head slightly. "You're analyzing the entire room." Giovanni didn't deny it. Instead he adjusted their position again, turning them slowly as the music swelled around them. Jessica noticed the subtle shift immediately. Their new angle gave Giovanni a clear view of the ballroom entrance behind her. For a few seconds he watched the doors without blinking. Then his body went completely still. Jessica felt the change instantly. The tension traveled through his arm and into her hand. "What is it?" she whispered. Giovanni didn't answer right away. His eyes had locked onto something behind her. "Don't look yet," he murmured quietly. Of course Jessica immediately wanted to look. "Giovanni, wait." His tone remained calm but carried an edge now. Jessica forced herself to stay still, though curiosity burned through her. After a moment Giovanni guided her into a slow spin, lifting her hand just enough for her to turn beneath his arm. The movement felt natural, part of the dance. But as she turned, Jessica's eyes briefly caught the entrance behind him. Two men had just stepped into the ballroom. They looked wrong immediately. Not poorly dressed. Their suits were dark and clean like everyone else's. But they moved differently. Their eyes didn't linger on the bride or the decorations or the champagne. They scanned the room the way Giovanni had been doing all night. Measuring. Searching. When Jessica completed the turn and faced Giovanni again, she saw the calm expression had finally cracked. It wasn't panic, not fear. But the careful mask he had worn until now had slipped just enough for her to see what was beneath it. Recognition. Giovanni leaned closer so only she could hear him. They found me. Jessica's stomach dropped. Who? She whispered. Giovanni didn't answer. Instead his hand closed firmly around hers, pulling her a step closer as if the dance required it. His voice dropped to a quiet, controlled whisper. Stay close to me, he said. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine as his eyes flicked briefly past her shoulder again toward the entrance. Or you might not survive this night. Jessica didn't move for a moment after Giovanni's warning. The music continued around them, couples still turning slowly across the dance floor, laughter drifting from nearby tables. To everyone else the reception still looked normal. But the grip of Giovanni's hand around hers had tightened just enough to erase any doubt that he meant what he said. Don't panic, he murmured quietly, his lips barely moving. Jessica swallowed. You just told me I might not survive the night. Giovanni's eyes flicked past her shoulder again toward the ballroom entrance. The two unfamiliar men had separated further into the crowd now. One moved slowly toward the bar. The other drifted along the wall near the gift table. Neither of them danced. Neither of them spoke to anyone. They watched. Giovanni exhaled slowly. Then he changed direction. The movement looked natural to anyone observing the dance. But instead of turning back toward the center of the floor, he guided Jessica steadily toward the outer edge where guests stood talking near the walls. Jessica followed, her pulse beginning to race. Where are we going? She whispered. Away from the open floor. Why? Giovanni didn't answer. They stepped out of the moving circle of couples and into the crowd of standing guests. For a moment it felt like nothing had changed. Then two large men appeared from opposite sides of the ballroom. Jessica hadn't seen them before. One stepped into place beside Giovanni without a word. The other positioned himself several feet behind them, facing the room. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't speak. But the way they stood made something inside Jessica's chest tighten. They weren't guests. They were security. Giovanni glanced briefly at the man beside him. How many? He asked quietly in Italian. The man answered just as softly. Jessica didn't understand the words, but the tone carried urgency. Giovanni nodded once. Then he turned his attention back to her. We're going to step away from the crowd for a moment, he said calmly. You're coming with me. Jessica blinked. Excuse me. Trust me. You keep saying that. Jessica shook her head. I don't even know you. Giovanni's expression softened slightly. You know enough. Before she could respond, another voice cut sharply through the moment. Jessica. Tyler. Jessica turned. Tyler had crossed the floor faster than she expected. Vanessa hovered several steps behind him, watching nervously as he approached. Tyler's eyes moved quickly over Giovanni, then over the two silent men standing nearby. Suspicion flashed across his face. Who the hell is this guy? Tyler demanded. Jessica opened her mouth, unsure what to say. Giovanni answered before she could. Giovanni Fioraldi, he said calmly, extending his hand slightly. Tyler ignored the gesture. I wasn't asking you. Giovanni lowered his hand without offense. That's unfortunate. Tyler's gaze moved between them. You disappear for 5 minutes and suddenly you're dancing with some stranger like you're married? His voice rose slightly. A few nearby guests glanced over. Jessica felt heat creeping up her neck. Tyler, not here. No, I think here is perfect. Tyler gestured toward Giovanni. Because I'd really like to know who thinks he can walk into my family's wedding and put his hands on. The bodyguard standing beside Giovanni stepped forward. The movement was smooth and controlled. He leaned slightly toward Tyler and murmured something quietly into his ear. Jessica couldn't hear the words, but she saw the effect immediately. Tyler froze. His face drained of color so quickly it was almost shocking. You're lying, Tyler whispered hoarsely. The bodyguard didn't respond. He simply stepped back into position beside Giovanni. Tyler looked at Giovanni again. Really looked this time. His anger collapsed into something very different. Fear. No, Tyler said quietly. You're joking. Giovanni's expression didn't change. He simply held Tyler's gaze with the calm patience of someone accustomed to reactions like this. Tyler took a step backward. Then another. Vanessa noticed the shift immediately. Tyler, she asked nervously. What's wrong? Tyler didn't answer her. His eyes were locked on Giovanni as if he had just realized something deeply unpleasant. Jessica felt her stomach twist. What did he say to you? She asked. Tyler didn't look at her. He kept staring at Giovanni as he spoke. You don't know who this is. Jessica frowned. Should I? Tyler let out a hollow laugh that held no humor at all. That's Giovanni Fioraldi. Jessica blinked. The name meant nothing to her. Tyler shook his head slowly. Jesus, Jessica. His voice dropped into a whisper. That's one of the most dangerous men in Chicago. The words landed heavily between them. Jessica turned slowly toward Giovanni. He met her gaze calmly. He didn't deny it. The ballroom continued buzzing with conversation and music around them, completely unaware that the atmosphere near the edge of the room had shifted. Jessica felt the ground under her certainty suddenly tilt. The man who had asked her to pretend to be his wife wasn't just a mysterious guest. He was something far more dangerous. Giovanni glanced briefly toward the entrance again. His eyes narrowed slightly. We need to leave this room, he said quietly. Jessica opened her mouth to respond. At that exact moment, a sharp cracking sound echoed from outside the ballroom windows. Then another. The music faltered. Several guests turned toward the sound in confusion. Giovanni's bodyguards moved instantly, stepping forward as their hands slipped inside their jackets. Jessica felt her pulse spike as the sound echoed again across the night air outside. Gunshots. The first scream broke the music. For a split second the ballroom froze in confusion, as if everyone expected the sound to resolve itself into laughter or a dropped glass. Then the second gunshot echoed outside the building, louder this time, sharp enough to rattle the tall windows lining the wall of the reception hall. Panic spread instantly. Guests turned toward the sound, voices rising in alarm. Someone shouted for security. Chairs scraped across the polished floor as people stood abruptly. A woman near the dance floor shrieked when another crack echoed through the night air outside. Jessica felt Giovanni's grip tighten around her wrist. Move, he said quietly. Before she could react, he pulled her toward one of the thick marble pillars lining the ballroom. His bodyguards moved with sudden precision, one stepping ahead of them while the other turned toward the entrance doors. The atmosphere shifted from celebration to chaos in seconds. The band stopped playing. The bride's voice could be heard somewhere in the confusion asking what was happening. Several men rushed toward the windows but were immediately pushed back by hotel security staff shouting for everyone to stay away from the glass. Jessica pressed against the pillar as Giovanni positioned himself slightly in front of her, blocking her view of the entrance. What is happening? She demanded, her voice shaking. Another gunshot cracked somewhere outside the building. This one sounded farther away, but the echo inside the ballroom was enough to send a wave of frightened whispers through the crowd. Hotel security hurried toward the main doors. One of them slammed the heavy locks into place while another shouted for everyone to remain inside. No one leaves the ballroom, he yelled. Please stay calm. The command had the opposite effect. Several guests began shouting at once. Someone tried to push toward the doors before being stopped by security. Jessica's pulse raced as she looked up at Giovanni. You said someone wanted to hurt you, she said. Is this about you? Giovanni didn't answer immediately. His eyes were focused on the far side of the ballroom where the two unfamiliar men had entered earlier. They were gone now. Vanished somewhere into the crowd during the confusion. Giovanni exhaled slowly. Then he turned toward her. Yes. Jessica stared at him. Yes, what? Yes, this is about me. His voice was steady, almost calm despite the rising panic around them. Jessica shook her head in disbelief. You're telling me someone is shooting outside a wedding because of you? Giovanni's gaze flicked briefly toward the locked doors. They're not shooting randomly. Jessica's stomach twisted. Then why? Giovanni lowered his voice so only she could hear him. Because the men who came in earlier belonged to a rival family. Jessica blinked. Family. Giovanni held her eyes for a moment. Mafia family. The word landed like a stone dropping into still water. Jessica felt her chest tighten. You're serious? Giovanni didn't respond with words. His silence answered everything. Jessica ran a hand through her hair in disbelief. This is insane, she whispered. Why here? Why tonight? Giovanni's expression hardened slightly. Because they believed I came here secretly. Secretly, Jessica repeated. You walked into a wedding reception in the middle of Chicago. Exactly. His tone carried a quiet edge now. A place where no one would expect trouble. Jessica felt a chill crawl down her spine. Another shout erupted across the ballroom as someone near the windows tried to look outside again. Security pushed them back quickly. The tension inside the room had grown thick and suffocating. Jessica looked back at Giovanni. Then why haven't they come in here? Giovanni's gaze moved briefly toward the windows again. Because they're waiting. Jessica frowned. For what? Giovanni's voice dropped to a near whisper. For me to leave. The realization spread slowly across Jessica's mind. So they're outside. Giovanni nodded once. Yes. Jessica glanced instinctively toward the doors. Then I'm leaving before this gets worse. She stepped away from the pillar. Giovanni's hand closed firmly around her arm before she could take another step. Jessica looked up at him sharply. Let go. Giovanni didn't release her. You can't leave. Why not? Her voice rose despite herself. Because you're standing next to me. Jessica frowned in confusion. What does that have to do with anything? Giovanni's eyes softened slightly, though the seriousness in them remained. They saw us dancing. Jessica felt a sudden coldness spread through her chest. So, Giovanni didn't hesitate. They think you're my wife. The words hung between them. Jessica stared at him. That's ridiculous. Giovanni's grip tightened slightly as another distant gunshot echoed outside. To them it isn't. Jessica felt her breathing quicken. Then you tell them the truth. Giovanni shook his head slowly. That won't matter now. Jessica swallowed hard. Why? Giovanni leaned closer so only she could hear his next words over the noise filling the ballroom. Because if they believe you matter to me, he paused. Jessica felt the blood drain from her face as the meaning settled in. Then you're a target. Jessica stepped backward instinctively. No, Giovanni's hand tightened again, stopping her before she could move away. Jessica looked toward the locked ballroom doors. I'm leaving anyway. Giovanni shook his head slowly. You can't. Watch me. Jessica turned toward the exit again. Giovanni pulled her back against the pillar before she could take another step. His voice dropped to a whisper against her ear. If you walk out alone. Jessica froze as she heard the quiet certainty in his voice. Giovanni's eyes moved briefly toward the dark windows at the far end of the ballroom. They'll shoot you first. Jessica stared at Giovanni as the weight of his warning settled over her. The ballroom behind them buzzed with rising panic. Guests clustered together in frightened groups, whispering, arguing with security, demanding to know what was happening outside. The music had stopped completely. Even the bride and groom had disappeared somewhere deeper in the hotel, escorted away by family members and staff. But Jessica barely noticed any of it. Her attention was fixed on the man standing in front of her. You expect me to stay here because someone might shoot me, she whispered. Giovanni's gaze remained steady. Not here, he said quietly. With me. Jessica shook her head immediately. Absolutely not. Giovanni didn't argue. Instead he glanced briefly across the ballroom again, his eyes tracking the movements of the crowd. You asked why they haven't come inside, he said. It's because they're waiting for a clear opportunity. Then we call the police, Jessica said quickly. Security already did. He nodded toward the far end of the room where 2 hotel staff were speaking urgently into radios. But police take time to arrive. And the men outside know that. Jessica folded her arms tightly across her chest. So what's your solution? Giovanni studied her for a moment before answering. You stay beside me. Jessica let out a disbelieving laugh. That's not a plan. It's the only one that works. She shook her head again. You just told me they're targeting you. Giovanni nodded. Yes. Then why would I stand next to you? His voice remained calm. Because they won't risk shooting me publicly if a civilian is attached to me. Jessica frowned. That doesn't make sense. It does to them. Giovanni leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice again. They want leverage. They want territory. They want fear. What they don't want is a massacre inside a ballroom full of witnesses. Jessica looked around the crowded room. Guests still stood everywhere, frightened but trapped. Cameras from several phones had already started recording the chaos. So your plan, she said slowly, is to use me as a human shield. Giovanni didn't flinch from the accusation. My plan is to keep you alive. Jessica stared at him. I'm not doing that. Giovanni opened his mouth to respond. But another voice cut in sharply from behind them. What exactly is going on here? Tyler had returned. Jessica turned, startled. Tyler stood only a few feet away. His face flushed with agitation. Vanessa hovered anxiously behind him, clutching her purse. Tyler's eyes moved between Jessica and Giovanni, anger flashing again now that the initial shock had faded. Why are you still standing with him? Tyler demanded. You should be leaving. Jessica tried to keep her voice steady. I can't leave. Tyler frowned. Why not? Giovanni answered calmly. Because it's safer if she stays with me. Tyler blinked at him. Then he laughed sharply. Safer. He looked at Jessica as if she had lost her mind. You actually believe that? Jessica stepped closer to Tyler. Lower your voice. But Tyler's frustration had already boiled over. You know who this guy is, he said loudly. Several nearby guests turned toward them again. Giovanni's bodyguards shifted subtly in position. Tyler gestured openly toward Giovanni. This is Giovanni Fioraldi. His voice echoed louder than Jessica expected in the suddenly quiet area around them. Conversations nearby stopped completely. Guests stared openly now. Vanessa's eyes widened in alarm. Tyler, she whispered urgently. But Tyler kept going. You're standing here like he's some random guy at a wedding, Tyler said to Jessica. He's not. Several people nearby began whispering. One older man stepped backward slowly, pulling his wife with him. The name had spread faster than Jessica expected. Giovanni didn't react outwardly. But Jessica saw the brief flicker in his eyes. Tyler pointed at him openly now. You know what he does. Tyler continued loudly. You know what kind of people he deals with. Jessica grabbed Tyler's arm. Stop. But it was already too late. Across the ballroom, one of the unfamiliar men who had entered earlier had stopped walking. His head turned slowly toward them. Jessica followed his gaze. The man near the bar had also turned. They had heard. Giovanni exhaled slowly. The calm mask returned to his face, but something darker settled behind his eyes now. Jessica released Tyler's arm and looked back at Giovanni. What did he just do? She whispered. Giovanni didn't answer immediately. His gaze had shifted toward the entrance doors again, calculating distances. He confirmed their suspicion, Giovanni said quietly. Jessica felt dread creeping up her spine. Suspicion about what? Giovanni met her eyes. About me. Jessica looked toward the 2 men across the room again. They were no longer pretending to be guests. One of them lifted a phone and spoke quietly into it. The other scanned the ballroom again until his eyes landed directly on Giovanni. Jessica felt the atmosphere in the room change. Not panic this time. Something worse. Recognition. The situation had just become real for everyone involved. Jessica turned slowly back toward Tyler. "You just made this worse," she whispered. Tyler frowned. "What are you talking about?" Giovanni's hand suddenly closed around Jessica's wrist again. Firm. Unavoidable. Jessica looked up at him. His expression had hardened completely now. No trace of the easy charm from earlier remained. Only calculation. Only control. Giovanni pulled her slightly closer to him as his eyes flicked toward the men watching from across the ballroom. Then he leaned closer to Jessica and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "Now," he murmured, tightening his grip around her hand, "you really can't leave my side." Giovanni didn't give Jessica time to argue. The moment the two men across the ballroom began moving again, he turned sharply and guided her toward the nearest side exit. One of his bodyguards stepped ahead of them, clearing a path through the confused crowd, while the other stayed close behind. Guests were still arguing with hotel security near the locked doors, their attention focused on the gunshots outside. Almost no one noticed when Giovanni steered Jessica through a narrow service doorway beside the kitchen entrance. The noise of the ballroom faded immediately behind them. The corridor on the other side was dim and narrow, lit by a row of overhead fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above stainless steel counters and stacks of catering trays. The smell of food and dish soap filled the air. Kitchen staff had abandoned the hallway in the chaos, leaving it eerily quiet compared to the panic behind the ballroom walls. Giovanni slowed only slightly as he guided her deeper down the corridor. His grip on her hand remained firm, his eyes scanning every intersection ahead. "Where are we going?" Jessica whispered, struggling to keep up with his long stride. "Somewhere less visible," he replied quietly. His bodyguard ahead paused at the next corner, checking the empty hallway before signaling for them to continue. Jessica's heart still pounded from the chaos in the ballroom. The muffled sound of frightened voices drifted faintly through the closed doors behind them. "This is insane," she said under her breath. Giovanni didn't respond immediately. They reached a quieter stretch of hallway near a row of supply closets. There he finally stopped, releasing her hand for the first time since they left the ballroom. Jessica leaned back against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. "You need to tell me what's happening," she said. Giovanni watched the hallway for a moment longer before turning toward her. "I will." But instead of explaining, he studied her face with the same focused attention he'd used earlier on the dance floor. It made Jessica uneasy. "What?" she asked. Giovanni tilted his head slightly. "Where did you study medicine?" Jessica froze. The question landed so unexpectedly that for a moment she couldn't respond at all. "What?" Giovanni repeated calmly. "Which medical school?" Jessica stared at him. "I never told you I studied medicine." Giovanni's expression didn't change. "No," he said quietly. "You didn't." Jessica pushed herself off the wall, confusion tightening her voice. "Then why would you ask that?" Giovanni folded his arms loosely across his chest, watching her closely. "Because earlier tonight a man fainted near the bar." Jessica blinked. The memory surfaced immediately. One of the older guests had collapsed suddenly while standing near the champagne table. People had panicked, stepping back and calling for help. Jessica had moved automatically, kneeling beside the man and checking his pulse before the hotel medic arrived. She hadn't thought twice about it. Giovanni continued calmly. "You checked his airway first," he said. "Then you loosened his collar and tilted his head slightly to keep him breathing properly." Jessica's pulse quickened again, but for a different reason. "Anyone could do that." Giovanni shook his head slowly. "No. Most people panic." Jessica looked away briefly, uncomfortable with the attention. Giovanni stepped slightly closer. "You stayed calm. You checked his pulse and watched his breathing without hesitation." He paused. "That's training." Jessica felt the weight of his gaze. "I worked in a hospital," she admitted finally. Giovanni's eyes narrowed slightly. As what? Jessica hesitated. The corridor suddenly felt too quiet. Too exposed. A nurse, she said. Giovanni studied her face for a moment longer. Not originally. Jessica exhaled slowly. You're very observant. Giovanni didn't smile. Medical school, he asked again. Jessica's shoulders lowered slightly. There didn't seem to be a reason to lie anymore. Yes, she said quietly. Giovanni waited. Jessica glanced down the empty hallway before continuing. I was in my second year. Giovanni's voice softened slightly. What happened? Jessica let out a small breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. Life happened. Giovanni remained silent, giving her space to continue. Jessica folded her arms loosely, leaning against the wall again. I got pregnant, she said simply. Lily. Giovanni nodded slightly. Jessica continued quietly. Medical school doesn't pause for unexpected babies. And Tyler. She stopped herself, shaking her head. He left. Giovanni's expression darkened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. I couldn't afford to keep going, Jessica finished. So I switched programs and became a nurse instead. The words hung in the corridor for a moment. Giovanni studied her carefully now, as if reevaluating something he hadn't noticed before. Jessica frowned slightly under the scrutiny. What? Giovanni's voice remained thoughtful. You stayed calm tonight. When? When the man fainted. Jessica shrugged slightly. Habit. Giovanni nodded slowly. His gaze drifted briefly toward the direction of the ballroom again, where the muffled panic still echoed faintly through the walls. Good, he said quietly. Jessica straightened slightly. Why does that matter right now? Giovanni looked back at her. The seriousness in his eyes had returned. Because this situation may get worse before it gets better. Jessica's stomach tightened again. You mean the men outside? Giovanni didn't answer directly. Instead he stepped closer, lowering his voice. If someone gets hurt tonight, he paused slightly. Jessica felt her pulse quicken again. I might need someone who knows how to keep them alive. Jessica stared at him. Giovanni held her gaze steadily. Then he leaned closer and whispered quietly. Then tonight. His voice dropped lower. I might need your help saving a life. The first explosion of gunfire inside the building shattered the fragile silence of the corridor. It wasn't distant this time. It came from the direction of the ballroom doors behind them. Loud, violent, unmistakable. Jessica flinched instinctively as the sharp bursts echoed down the narrow hallway. Giovanni's head snapped toward the sound. His bodyguards reacted even faster. The man at the end of the corridor drew a weapon from beneath his jacket with practiced speed, stepping forward to block the hallway. Another burst of gunfire followed, closer this time. Somewhere inside the ballroom someone screamed. The sound carried through the walls like a ripple of panic spreading through the building. Jessica felt her chest tighten. They're inside, she whispered. Giovanni didn't answer. His expression had hardened into something cold and focused. He turned slightly toward his bodyguard. How many? He asked in Italian. The man pressed a hand to the small earpiece tucked behind his ear, listening to voices Jessica couldn't hear. 4, he said quietly. Maybe 5. Another sharp crack echoed down the corridor as something heavy slammed against one of the ballroom doors. Guests were shouting now. Furniture scraped across the floor. Someone was crying. The wedding had collapsed into chaos. Giovanni turned back toward Jessica. Stay behind us. Jessica opened her mouth to protest, but another gunshot exploded nearby, close enough that the sound vibrated through the walls. Giovanni's bodyguard moved forward immediately, pushing the kitchen door open just enough to see into the ballroom. The moment the door cracked open, more noise poured into the corridor. Shouting, breaking glass, frantic voices screaming for help. Then the bodyguard stepped back sharply. They're coming through the side entrance, he said. Giovanni nodded once. Move! The hallway erupted into motion. The bodyguard nearest the corner advanced carefully, weapon raised. Giovanni guided Jessica quickly toward a storage alcove along the wall, positioning her partially behind him. Jessica's heart hammered in her chest as the noise from the ballroom intensified. The wedding guests who had been celebrating minutes earlier were now running for cover. Jessica could hear chairs toppling and dishes crashing. Another burst of gunfire cracked through the air. This time it came from inside the building. They breached the ballroom, the bodyguard near the door said grimly. Jessica's breath caught. Giovanni's jaw tightened. How many civilians? Dozens. Giovanni's gaze flicked toward Jessica briefly. Stay here. Wait, she said quickly. But Giovanni had already turned toward the corridor again, preparing to move. Before he could take another step, two more of his security men appeared rushing down the hallway from the opposite direction. One of them stumbled slightly as he reached them. Jessica noticed it immediately. Blood. The man clutched his side as he leaned against the wall, breathing hard. They came through the service entrance, he said through clenched teeth. 3 of them. Automatic weapons. Giovanni stepped toward him immediately. Marco. Jessica saw the concern flicker briefly across Giovanni's otherwise controlled expression. Marco, the injured guard, tried to stand upright but winced sharply. Blood soaked through his suit jacket near his ribs, spreading quickly. Jessica's instincts took over before she could think. He's bleeding heavily, she said, already stepping forward. Giovanni looked at her. Jessica. But she had already moved beside Marco, lowering him carefully to the floor. The hallway lights reflected off the growing stain of blood spreading beneath him. Jessica pressed a hand against the wound, applying pressure immediately. Marco sucked in a sharp breath but didn't pull away. Bullet? She asked quickly. Grazed, Marco said through clenched teeth. Maybe. Jessica peeled back the edge of his jacket carefully. The wound was deep but not fatal yet. Blood still flowed steadily from the torn flesh along his side. We need something to stop the bleeding, she said. One of the guards immediately grabbed a stack of kitchen towels from a nearby cart. Jessica folded them quickly and pressed them firmly against the wound. Marco groaned but stayed conscious. Giovanni crouched beside them, watching her movements closely. Will he live? Jessica didn't look up. If the bleeding stops. She tightened the pressure on the wound, focusing on the rhythm of Marco's breathing. Another burst of gunfire erupted from somewhere deeper in the building. The sound echoed through the corridor again, followed by the crash of something heavy hitting the floor. Jessica forced herself to ignore it. Stay with me, she said to Marco. Look at me. Marco's breathing steadied slightly as she continued pressing the makeshift bandage against his side. The blood flow began to slow. Giovanni studied her carefully, his eyes dark with calculation. Jessica barely noticed his gaze. Her attention stayed fixed on the injured guard in front of her. This wasn't a hospital. This wasn't a controlled emergency room with clean equipment and monitors. This was a kitchen corridor in the middle of a gunfight. And yet her training had taken over completely. Marco exhaled slowly as the bleeding slowed under the pressure of the bandage. Jessica finally leaned back slightly, wiping blood from her hands onto a nearby cloth. For a moment the hallway was quiet except for the distant sounds of chaos from the ballroom. Giovanni looked at her. You just saved his life. Jessica glanced down at her blood-covered hands. The weight of the moment settled over her slowly. Minutes ago she had been a guest at a wedding. Now she was kneeling on the floor beside a wounded bodyguard while gunfire echoed through the building. She looked back up at Giovanni. His expression had changed again. Something like respect flickered behind his eyes. Jessica realized something with sudden clarity. There was no going back to the quiet safety of the reception hall. She had crossed a line the moment she knelt beside Marco. Whether she wanted it or not. The hallway outside the service corridor eventually fell quiet enough for Giovanni to move them again. Marco had been carried away by two of the guards to a safer room farther down the building where they could stabilize him until medical help arrived. The gunfire had slowed to scattered bursts somewhere outside the venue. Police sirens echoed faintly in the distance, still far away. Giovanni led Jessica through a series of narrow back hallways used by the catering staff until they reached a small private office behind the kitchen storage area. One of his bodyguards pushed the door open, quickly scanning the room before nodding. "Clear." Giovanni stepped aside and gestured for Jessica to enter. She walked inside slowly. The room was small and windowless, filled with shelves of paperwork, cleaning supplies, and a metal desk shoved against one wall. It smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The bodyguard closed the door behind them and stood outside to guard the hallway. The sudden quiet inside the room felt surreal after the chaos. Jessica leaned back against the desk, finally allowing her shoulders to drop. Her hands still carried faint stains of dried blood from Marco's wound. For a moment neither of them spoke. The distant sounds of chaos outside the building continued like a muffled storm beyond the walls. Jessica looked at Giovanni. "You owe me the truth." Giovanni didn't pretend to misunderstand. He stood across the small room from her, one hand resting against the back of a chair. "About what?" Jessica let out a short breath of disbelief. "About everything." She gestured toward the door behind them where the bodyguard stood watch. "About the gunman outside. About the bodyguards. About why I'm suddenly hiding in a storage office during my sister's wedding." Giovanni studied her quietly. "You already know the most important part. That you're Mafia," Jessica said flatly. Giovanni didn't deny it. Jessica folded her arms tightly across her chest. "Then answer the question I've been asking since this started." Giovanni waited. Jessica held his gaze steadily. "Why me?" The question hung between them. "There were hundreds of guests in that ballroom tonight," she continued. "Women sitting at every table. You could have asked any one of them to dance." Giovanni didn't interrupt. Jessica took a step closer. "But you walked straight toward me." Giovanni remained silent for a few seconds longer. Then he exhaled slowly and moved toward the desk, leaning one hip against it. "Because you were the only honest person in the room." Jessica frowned slightly. "That doesn't make any sense." Giovanni shook his head slightly. "It does if you know what to look for." Jessica watched him carefully. "Explain." Giovanni glanced briefly toward the closed door before speaking again. "When I arrived tonight, I spent nearly 20 minutes watching the room." Jessica blinked in surprise. "Watching. Observing." His voice remained calm. "That's what I do when I walk into any unfamiliar place." Jessica frowned. "You mean you were scanning the crowd?" Giovanni nodded once. "Every table, every guest, every exit." Jessica waited. Giovanni continued. "Most people at weddings behave the same way," he said quietly. "They laugh too loudly. They smile too much. They pretend to be happier than they actually are." Jessica tilted her head slightly. "And?" Giovanni's eyes settled on her again. "And then I saw you." Jessica felt a strange warmth creep up the back of her neck. "Sitting alone near the kitchen doors," Giovanni said. "At the worst table in the room." Jessica gave a humorless smile. That part was accurate. Giovanni's gaze softened slightly. "You weren't pretending." Jessica frowned. "Pretending what?" "That you belonged there." Jessica didn't answer. Giovanni continued quietly. "Everyone else in that ballroom was performing," he said. "Trying to look perfect. Trying to impress someone." He paused briefly. "You were just surviving the night." Jessica looked down at the floor. The words struck closer than she expected. Giovanni went on. "You weren't watching the decorations or the champagne tower," he said. "You were watching the exits." Jessica looked up again, surprised. Giovanni nodded slightly. "That's what caught my attention." Jessica felt her pulse quicken. "I was thinking about leaving," she admitted. Giovanni's voice remained steady. "Exactly." Jessica hesitated. That's why you chose me. Giovanni studied her for a moment before answering. Because people who survive situations instead of performing for them tend to be honest. Jessica looked away briefly, absorbing the explanation. So you trusted me, she said quietly. Giovanni nodded once. More than the others. Jessica shook her head slightly, still trying to process everything that had happened in the past hour. You trusted a complete stranger. Giovanni's voice softened slightly. You weren't acting. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Giovanni's phone vibrated sharply in his jacket pocket. The sound cut through the quiet room like a warning. Giovanni pulled the phone out immediately. His expression changed as he read the message on the screen. Jessica saw the shift instantly. What is it? She asked. Giovanni didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened slightly as he read the message again. Jessica stepped closer. Giovanni. He finally looked up at her. The calm certainty that had carried him through the night had shifted again into something darker. We have a problem. Jessica felt her stomach drop. What kind of problem? Giovanni held up the phone so she could see the message glowing on the screen. A short text from one of his security contacts. One line. Someone inside the wedding leaked your location. For several long minutes after Giovanni showed her the message, neither of them spoke. The quiet office suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer. Outside the door, the hallway carried distant sounds. Voices shouting instructions, hurried footsteps, radios crackling between security teams. Somewhere farther away, police sirens began to rise through the night air, faint at first but growing steadily louder as they approached the venue. Jessica leaned back against the desk again, her mind trying to process the words she had just read. Someone inside the wedding leaked your location. Her sister's wedding. Her family. The place that was supposed to be safe. Who would do that? She asked quietly. Giovanni slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket. Someone who was paid well enough to forget loyalty. Jessica frowned. From my family. Giovanni didn't answer directly. Instead he moved toward the door and opened it slightly. One of his bodyguards stood in the hallway outside, speaking urgently into a radio. Giovanni exchanged a few quick words with him in Italian before stepping back inside. The attackers are pulling back, Giovanni said calmly. Jessica blinked. Just like that. They weren't here to start a war tonight, Giovanni replied. They came to confirm my presence. Jessica felt the weight of that statement. And now they have. Giovanni nodded slightly. The distant police sirens had grown louder now, echoing across the city streets outside the venue. Jessica exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders little by little. The chaos was ending. The worst part of the night was finally passing. So what happens now? She asked. Giovanni looked toward the hallway again. Now the police arrive. Jessica gave a tired laugh. Which means I can finally go home. Giovanni didn't answer. Jessica pushed herself away from the desk, glancing down at her dress. The elegant navy fabric was wrinkled now, stained faintly with dried blood from Marco's wound. She barely recognized herself compared to the woman who had arrived at the wedding hours earlier. My sister is going to kill me, she murmured. Giovanni's gaze softened slightly. Your sister will be grateful you're alive. Jessica walked toward the door slowly. You should probably stay here until the police finish questioning everyone, she said. I doubt they'll be thrilled to find out a Mafia boss attended the wedding. Giovanni watched her quietly as she reached the doorway. Jessica paused there, turning back toward him. For the first time since the night began, the room felt almost calm. The chaos outside was fading into sirens and flashing lights. Guests were being escorted out of the ballroom in small groups. The nightmare was ending. Jessica forced a small tired smile. Well, she said softly. That was the worst wedding reception in history. Giovanni almost smiled. Almost. Jessica reached for the door handle. I should go check on my sister. Before she could open the door, Giovanni stepped forward. Jessica. A turn. Giovanni stood only a few feet away now. His expression was calm again, but something thoughtful lingered behind his eyes. Wait, he said quietly. Jessica hesitated. Giovanni reached into his jacket pocket once more. For a moment Jessica thought he was pulling out his phone again. Instead he removed a small folded card. He stepped closer and gently took her hand, turning her palm upward. Jessica watched silently as he placed the card into her hand and closed her fingers around it. His touch lingered for just a second longer than necessary. "What's this?" she asked softly. Giovanni released her hand. "My number." Jessica looked down at the card. The numbers were written neatly in dark ink. "Why would I need that?" Giovanni met her gaze steadily. "Because tonight doesn't end here." Jessica frowned slightly. "The attackers left." Giovanni nodded once. "For now." Jessica felt the uneasiness return. "You think they'll come back?" Giovanni's voice remained calm. "If they believe you matter to me, they might." Jessica looked down at the card again. The weight of it suddenly felt heavier than it should. She slipped it slowly into her purse. "So that's it?" she asked. "We just go back to normal?" Giovanni studied her face for a moment before answering. "Normal is a relative word." Jessica gave a quiet laugh. "Fair enough." She stepped toward the door again, then stopped. Something in her chest tugged unexpectedly. She turned back toward him once more. Giovanni was still standing where she had left him, watching her with the same calm focus he had shown all night. Jessica hesitated. "One question." Giovanni nodded slightly. "Ask." Jessica took a breath. Was any of this real? The question hung quietly between them. Giovanni didn't answer immediately. For a moment the only sound in the room was the distant echo of police sirens outside the building. Then he stepped a little closer. His voice was calm when he spoke. The danger was real. Jessica held his gaze. Giovanni's expression softened slightly. "But the dance," he said quietly, "wasn't pretend." Jessica felt her breath catch unexpectedly. Neither of them spoke again for a moment. Finally Jessica nodded once, turning back toward the door. She stepped out into the hallway where the chaos of the night was slowly fading into flashing lights and quiet conversations with police officers. Behind her, Giovanni remained inside the small office, watching the door long after she disappeared down the corridor. Outside the hotel, the rain had finally started falling. Jessica stepped into the cool night air, the folded card still resting inside her purse. Some nights change your life forever. Others just reveal the life that was already waiting.